Well, it is now my distinct pleasure to introduce Antonio Payne, Chief Financial Officer and Chief Diversity Officer at SMPS headquarters. Antonio.
Thank you, Kevin. Welcome, everybody. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our third annual Pride Talk. And I'm filled with pride today at the work that our SMPS committee has done on behalf of our board, our interim CEO. Thank you all for joining us here today. We recognize the diversity, our diversity is reflected in different people and our different firms. We believe our ethnicities, cultures, religions, beliefs, genders, sexual orientations, age, level of experience, physical abilities, and other differences benefit us as individuals and as an organization. So it is with pride that I introduce Russell Pollard, the principal of Framework Leadership, to officially start our program. We are so excited to have him. And I will be speaking at the end about some future programming we have for you all. You would have seen it in our earlier slides, but very excited to announce our DEI certificate program, which will be launching later in June. And we also have our next Pride Talk, which we will talk about a little bit at the end. Russell, the virtual stage is yours.
Hello again, and thank you, Antonio. So thank you for having us back. As Antonio mentioned, I'm principal of Framework Leadership, also a past president of our SMPS Ontario chapter. So I see some folks from Ontario joining us, so shout out to you. What is Pride Talks? Well, Pride Talks is a program that's industry specific to bring topics that relate to the queer inclusion, queer representation, and queer leadership in the industry. Most of them are focused on workplace culture and the impact of our work on the built environment. However, SMPS was an early adopter, early participant, so we've always adopted some of the programs to be marketing specific. So the first one we did was applying marketing skills and knowledge to support LGBT inclusion in the industry. Last year, we focused on queer considerations with the intersections of folks who are disabled for digital access to our marketing content. And this year, we have Nyasha, who is presenting on communications considerations with someone you'll be introduced to called Reference Man. So thank you again for bringing us back. And I'm going to ask Nyasha to switch slides for now. So we do start with a land acknowledgement. So here we are in Toronto. So we recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples and acknowledge that our work is hosted on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendiet peoples. And then this specific land acknowledgement comes from Reset, which is an intentional community space. They're not designers, but they did tailor their space to reflect that they believe that collective joy requires justice. So some of the things we considered in the design of this space include collective liberation, safety, care, identities, Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, ecology, equity, power, inclusion, physical and financial accessibility, ancestry, climate, introversion, extroversion, trauma, and neurodiversity. So they really accommodate a lot, and that's what we aim to do as well through our programs, reflecting queer communities as intersectional and approaches to inclusion as requiring an intersectional one. And then we are not experts in any of these realms, and we are always open to learning how we can better cultivate a culture of radical welcoming and belonging. And so this is key too, when it comes to ED&I or DEI, not any one person is necessarily an expert. There are probably a few, but it's really about what we can learn from each other and what we can achieve together. So thank you for tuning in for that. And then just over the course of our program, I mean, we've done this 3 years. About 20 odd employers have participated many year after year. I noticed someone from Mekalani is in the room from British Columbia. Ali is doing their transgender and gender nonconforming talk with your firm later today. And we always donate back to queer supporting groups. Last year, we focused on engineers who identify as queer entering the profession to support them. This year, for next slide, we're focusing on two organizations that are preserving the history and the stories of trans folk, both in Canada, and since many of our clientele are based in the UK, their museum there. So thank you for joining us today. Now I'm going to introduce Nyasha, who has quite an intro for herself during the talk, but I just want to say thank you, Nyasha, for being a part of Pride Talks and sharing this and adapting this for the communication folks in the room. And yes, I shall leave you be to present. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Russell, and thanks so much to the folks at SMPS. So let's get started. So I'm an archivist, which is the delightful blend of architect and activist. And as an archivist, as a thought leader, as a speaker, but also as a marketer, a business developer, and as a concerned world citizen, my role has been to challenge the status quo, and in this case, to empower you to take action towards creating queer, inclusive futures, leaving no one behind. So for the past decade, I've dedicated my career to raising awareness, empowering others, and uncovering actionable solutions to accelerate the transition towards inclusive, just, regenerative, net zero communities and cities. And that's really what makes my heart sing. So I have a background in architecture, background and training, and I worked for a number of years as an architect in Europe. On diverse types of projects, affordable housing, civic buildings, mixed-use developments, schools, quite a wide range, before transitioning into business development and marketing in the architecture field, especially and urban design, to focus on projects to get that impact and influence those that commission projects, like all of you are very familiar with. And lastly, I was working at UN Studio doing that in business development. So working in the field, I knew that I would move out of this traditional practice and wanted to focus on some of the systemic issues that were impacting the built environment. So engaging with them through, the lens of privilege and power and equity. And so that's really where I made that transition, into the space of archtivism. So I engage in thought leadership and public speaking around these topics and to raise awareness around these challenges that we have in the built environment, but also creating content, teaching, social media to be able to bring out insights about tackling the climate crisis and the social inequality crises that we face today. Working also across different communications with industry media, but also with different nonprofits and advising cities on DEI, et cetera. So a wide range of having impact in different means, but through what I just called archtivism. And at this moment now, I'm director of programs at CP Planning, a Toronto-based urban and community planning nonprofit. And we use a human rights-based approach, working directly with communities, bridging that gap between communities and the professional field to support them with affordable housing development and inclusive economies, especially for marginalized communities. So I've shared a little bit about my journey from architecture to archtivism, but as my younger self embarked on her architecture journey, it became increasingly clear to me that something or someone rather was getting in the way of progress. See, I met this guy in architecture school, and he was a guy that would go on to follow me well into my career as an architect. And his mantra was, design for me and you'll design for everyone. And truth be told, every single one of you here knows him very well and quite intimately at that. So any idea who he might be? Reference man. So you're 6 foot tall, cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied, upper middle class, neuronormative white man. And so this is the supposed normal human standard that's been used in design to just design just about everything. So probably the chairs you're sitting at, the desks that you're at, the entire buildings that you're in, the streets around it. And sometimes if reference man doesn't ring a bell in the architecture world, especially, but in the AEC industry, the Vitruvian man is often used, or Le Corbusier's modular man is often used as a start to design things in a standardized neutral manner. So historically, our cities have been designed by and for reference men, and it's that continued myopia that completely disregards, women, children, the elderly, people of color, LGBTQ plus people, people with disabilities, neurodiverse individuals, and even most men. So it's quite exclusive. And it's the reason, for example, that our wheelchair bound community can't easily access a lot of public buildings or spaces in the public realm, or that our elderly might stay at home and inactive for lack of outdoor spaces for them to rest when they're out going to the market or something on a hot day. Or that I learned as a young woman to walk home alert as ever with keys, sticking out of my fisted hand. But worse yet, it's also the reason that our transgender community, for example, often feels compelled to hold their urine in all day if they're in public, or they might avoid public pools or fitness centers due to the lack of inclusive facilities and lack of safety, therefore, which obviously compromises their health. So it's important to know that, this inequality is really baked into our built environment. Our streetscapes, our infrastructure are all shaped around this reference man lifestyle. And, he drives to work in the morning, he drives home in time for dinner, to dinner made by Mrs. Reference man, and to kiss his 2 kids goodnight. And so we have these entire cities that are designed around this archaic point of reference of this traditional male commuter and his car. And if we just look at gender disaggregated data, we know that men travel about double the distance by car than women, and women might have different travel patterns. And this is especially when thinking about carers in society. So in society nowadays, that tends to be women, but this is the lens that we're looking at here. We'll tend to walk, bike, take public transport, do chain tripping, all sorts of different patterns. And that's just looking at women. If we look at the queer community, a lot of people are in precarious employment, so 3 times more likely. And so that's irregular hours, low income, for example, part-time, maybe lack of benefits. And so you might be thinking, okay, what does that have to do with the built environment and public space? Well, in terms of public infrastructure, it means that lots of the time they're relying heavily on public transport and are using this transport on off-peak times, so late at night, early morning. They might be spending a lot of time in public spaces like transit stations or bus stops that might lack the amenities that they need. So it's really this, the built environment is not shaped around their travel patterns even, and may create, a sense of anxiety around the fact that these spaces might not be safe or might not be catering to the types of uses that they're doing that affect more the queer community than not. So why don't we create more inclusive ways of designing? And I think that our public spaces, shared streets really go to show kind of the success of thinking else, like thinking about non-reference man identities, thinking about the vast diversity of age, culture, able-bodiedness, socioeconomic background, gender identity, sexual orientation, and so on. And what arises from that is some really nice examples. Here's one of thinking about different users who might be main users in the end, because reference man, as we've seen, is quite exclusive, and how it can lead to quite playful, joyful spaces that are more inclusive to many users. So reference man is also your poster child for industrialization and urbanization. So it's really boasts this urban lifestyle that's very much at odds with nature. So ditching reference man is also an opportunity to design for all living beings, and that goes beyond the human race. So it's about going from people-centric to life-centric. And it means that, birds, bats, and butterflies and bamboo grasses shouldn't be things that we only put in our renders to win competitions, but should actually form part of an integral part of our buildings. And the result is, biodiverse and healthier and more livable. So who doesn't really want that, right? So from our relationship with nature to safety and accessibility or lack thereof, it's clear that it's our, society's biased love affair with reference man that's really impeding our ability to create much more inclusive, regenerative, and resilient cities that we all actually deserve and would thrive in. So we might not know what the ideal city looks like, but we do know that it doesn't revolve around reference man, and that it's eclectic, it's not one size fits all. And it's where my being a petite, queer, Black woman and mom is not a handicap, but rather a strength. So it's about thinking of creating cities that are built around systemic empathy. So now I want to talk a bit about the role that has in the AEC industry, and what role we can have to foster more queer, inclusive built environments. And then I'll talk specifically about our role as marketers and business developers. So I think designing for every single human and living creature out there all at once is very challenging, if not overwhelming. So we have to start somewhere anyways. So where can we start? Well, the one thing that I always tell designers and tell those that are at the inception of projects is to consciously stop designing for this archaic reference that is reference man, and to incorporate non-reference man identities into the way that we design, native plants also, and local animals. So to start with that, just one non-reference man identity for each project, and with each designer having a different focus, this patchwork of the inclusive city will begin to emerge. For example, if we see that, heterosexual men are 26% more likely to be consulted on public space design than the queer community, it goes to show to what extent then the needs of heterosexual men are prioritized in terms of being the things that we would consider for people in general as being what we would need to cater, or what we would need to include into our built environment. So it's really crucial to actively include queer people in the process and make sure that those diverse needs are met. Russell touched on intersectionality, and that's what I want to do here as well, is just touch on the fact that for one, the queer community is very broad and encompassing many different gender identities and different sexual orientations as well. And beyond that, there's all these other factors that go on to kind of compounding the aspects of how one might experience public space. And when we think of the fact that for some queer folks, we're able to turn down or hide parts of your queer identity in public place, so that might also have an impact as to how you engage with public space, whereas that's going to be harder for visual minorities or for racialized folks or some transgender people, for example, to be able to turn down aspects that might be very visibly visible. So that's also something to think about. Thinking on intersectionality, I wanted to touch on the idea of neighborhoods as well, which sometimes I think it's important to think beyond stereotypes and to think about the intersectional aspect of the experiences of the queer community, whereas sometimes these spaces are cater predominantly to a wealthier white cisgender gay man as a specific group within the queer community, and have activities that are centered a lot around drinking or casual sex. But it's important to understand that queer inclusivity is beyond looking at one group within the queer community, and making sure that there are spaces that can really foster that real sense of welcoming and representation and diversity that is also there within the queer community. So I'm going to mention this study that's done by Arup a few times. It's a study that I think is quite nice in spotlighting the lived experiences of the queer community, those that were surveyed for the purpose of the study, but it also has this critical, it helps to bridge that critical data gap that we have between the queer community and the built environment. There's not a lot of work being done to kind of connect those and understand the experiences there. So one of the big findings in looking at what an inclusive space might mean to queer people, like one of the words that really came out was safe. So starting there, how do we design places that are safe? How can we create built environments that are safe? I want to touch on an example. That's this train station. So I think it's a space that really exemplifies safety and security and kind of one of the busiest places that's like a train station. So this is a project by UN Studio. And the structure of the building, due to this twist sort of column-like structure, led to the fact that there was no need for multiple structures, multiple columns in the building. And so you have these clear sight lines, a lot of visibility. And so one of the things that's come up a lot in terms of queer inclusive design is high visibility, clear sight lines, and creating this inclusive sense of openness. And so by having this structure, it's been able to be seen, you could argue, as being more queer inclusive. That wasn't necessarily the starting point, but in terms of it meeting some of the needs that have come up as from the queer community as being inclusive, or what they look for inclusivity, this could be considered one of them. But there's also something to consider when it comes to visibility and privacy, because there's a security paradox. So about 79% of the respondents of the Arab study that I mentioned earlier said that they would prefer high visibility spaces, because then they feel like they can see what's happening, they feel safe. But 20% argued that actually this high visibility spaces make them feel unsafe. So there's really this duality, and you can see with this quote that I'm sure you've had time to read since it's been up, so I won't read it for you, but that you get this duality between being able to be yourself when you're in a space that's a bit less visible, but also wanting to have that visibility to see and what's going on and feel safe. So that contrast and that balance is really going to be interesting in terms of accommodating diverse comfort levels. Another aspect that's interesting is lighting. So looking at that intersectional lens again, the quality of lighting is almost 3 times more important for LGBTQ women and transgender folk than heterosexual men. So even within the queer community, of course, there's going to be different needs or different experiences in there. So having good lighting, and not just lighting for the sake of lighting, but really good quality lighting, is really going to be an important part of helping to decrease those feelings of vulnerability, for example. And having ambient, human scale lighting can help with the safety and inclusive feelings. And so this is a project that was this sort of dark spot, this park between two halves of the town, and by lighting it up and creating this soft human scale lighting, it's now become more of like a spot where people come together and kind of gluing the two parts of the town together. So lighting can have a lot of power and can also be a part of creating queer, inclusive, and safe spaces. Now, changing typology completely, I wanted to touch on restrooms, which has been a focal point in the queer equality discussions, especially addressing discrimination against transgender individuals. And so this is a project by Mixed Design for the Gallaudet University. And what's interesting here is that they started with the needs of a non-reference man identity. So looking here at trans people who were having issues being able to feel safe in the sex segregated toilets and restrooms that we're very used to having at this time still in society. And so they started there, but they were able to include all sorts of different aspects. So seating, changing tables, dry counters for medical procedures, or shower accommodations for people of the Muslim faith, for example, to perform ablution. There's all sorts of different features that they were able to think of and create something that's much more inclusive even than that first non-reference man identity. So starting from non-reference man identity, and then reaching out from there and thinking how it can be more inclusive has led to, yeah, very innovative design that really sets the standards in terms of inclusion. There's even stalls that might be a little larger than others for people who might be a little larger, or for little people, there's some that are lower. So just thinking about inclusion way beyond the confines of starting with reference man, which is what we're used to doing, and really rethinking that has led to something that's much more innovative and really rethinks restrooms entirely. So I think it's a nice example to show. Moving again to housing. Here, I wanted to focus a little bit more on some of the external factors that might affect the queer community, and especially dealing with homelessness being a big one, because a significant percentage of the queer community is in core housing need or at risk of being homeless, and that's kind of across the board. Here, I have some statistics, especially looking at that intersectional lens again. When we look at youth, we see that there's even more of a crisis there, and the fact that about I think 25 to 40% of homeless youth, at least here in Canada, identify as being part of the 2S LGBTQIA plus community. And same for transgender folks and gender non-conforming people. They're twice as likely to be in severe poverty and be homeless. So thinking about the housing crises that we're all dealing with and thinking about housing is also thinking about how we're addressing the needs of a queer community. So this is an example of a project that's in Detroit, the Ruth Ellis Claremont Center, and it's designed by LBBA, a Chicago firm. And here it's really about having health services and affordable housing for LGBTQ plus youth. And one of the really interesting things I think about this design is the fact that it starts with the idea of thinking about a specific intersectional non-reference man identity. And by starting from there, there's this idea that you'll be able to create something that's much more inclusive for a broader group. And I think the co-executive director of the center said that if their idea was that if the space, if it was a space that a trans woman of color might feel safe in and might want to be in, then they believed that it would be a space that was more likely to be affirming and accepting of the other LGBTQ youth, or just youth in general. And so really this idea of starting with a very marginalized group and starting from there to be able to branch out into creating something that's much more inclusive is a new way of thinking, and I think a very queer inclusive approach to thinking about our spaces. Another aspect closely linked to homelessness is the aspect of hostile architecture and hostile urban environments, which is really all about discouraging behaviors like sleeping or resting in public spaces. And so here we have an array of the type of hostile designs where we create spaces that are exclusive. They are excluding certain types of behaviors and certain people who might be having those behaviors. And due to the fact that there's that high proportion of queer individuals that are homeless, this is something that particularly then affects the queer community. And it's not only about what you do put in, but also about what you don't put in the design. So I think that it's also interesting to think about the omission of things and how that can heighten feelings of anxiety if there aren't those amenities that are there. So emissions is also a powerful tool that can be used in this case negatively to create this exclusion. So thinking about that as well. So what's on the flip side? What can we do to create inclusive spaces? And I think it's an important point because about 36%, the queer community is about 36% more likely to prioritize inclusivity when it comes to places that they might want to live or work. So if they think of places inclusive in general, then they're more likely to want to work there. So by creating places that are hostile and that are exclusive, you're sending the signal that it's not a place then for the queer community either. So here's a project in Copenhagen in Denmark where it's all about bringing together this this community, this neighborhood that's very diverse and that has a lot of different nationalities, and celebrating them. So having these little follies and little urban seating or urban furniture, and having one from every single country that's represented in the community, and bringing together this playfulness and these little aspects that come back in the design. And so this type of way of thinking of creating something that's inclusive in general to maybe a broader audience than just queer inclusive specifically is in turn also queer inclusive, because that's what a lot of the queer community look for. If it seems inclusive, then the reasoning is that then I would also feel included in this space too. Another aspect to look at, and I'll just have two more here before we jump into our role as marketers, is green. And this was the second most common aspect of what contributes to creating an inclusive space. And so that's important. I think that there's a lot of work now on green building, but also just on nature inclusive spaces and places. And if we dig deeper into that green, it's not talking only about, you know, manicured lawns type green, but that biodiverse, the roughness, the wilder, the more organic green spaces, particularly ones where people feel that they can have some form of engagement or volunteering. So this is a project here that I worked on in my architecture designing days. And here we were asked to actually build more houses, but we decided to reduce it to be able to bring more to the neighborhood and to the community. So of course, there was a lot of work in terms of stimulating biodiversity, reducing heat island effect, managing stormwater and whatnot. But it was also about having this green space function as a gathering space, as a space where people could play, where people could just be. And so really pushing on this aspect of less is more in a sense. But that aspect of creating this green, lush area as being something that's queer inclusive and that's inclusive in general, I think mirrors this idea of biodiversity. If we're able to see this richness in the types of natural elements around us, we also get a sense of feeling of inclusion in some ways. So last example here is making that connection between nature and healthcare. So we know that the queer community is actually much more likely to report having feeling that their mental health is poor or it's fair. It's about a 3-to-1 ratio to the heterosexual individuals. And same for contemplating suicide, we're at 4-to-1 for the queer community, and likewise for anxiety disorders. So we know that there's a lot of anxiety around healthcare. There's repeated traumas as well. So having calming and healing spaces is going to be something that's going to be very important towards queer inclusive design. And so here's an example of Maggie centers, which mainly in the UK. I think they have a couple abroad, but they provide support for communities, for people, and their families who are facing cancer diagnoses and who are dealing with that. And one of the things that they really put forward is that they want to create spaces of healing. And what they say is that what matters most is not to lose the joy of living to the fear of dying. And so this space on the left here, to me, doesn't even look like a healthcare kind of space. And of course, we're not talking about, very clinical or hospital spaces that need to have certain codes and need to be extremely clean and safe in that aspect. This is more about, some of the other sort of welcoming spaces that we might have in healthcare and clinics. And here, what's great about it is that it feels like a living room. So we have this very welcoming space. It's connected to natural elements. So this one is by Foster. They always get different architects, quite well-known architects to design. Another one here by ALA and Sarah Prince Landscapes. And same, you get this very serene feeling. So thinking about, thoughtful lighting, natural views, green, the natural elements, this connection to nature, but also having kitchen tables where people can come together. All of these aspects can also be an interesting part of creating more queer inclusive, in this case, healthcare centers that can really help with reducing that anxiety and that trauma that's linked to healthcare. So now that we know what queer inclusive spaces might look like or what they might be like, some of the ingredients that go into that, what role do we play as AEC marketers and business developers in advancing these types of queer inclusive built environments and making them come to light? So I'll take you through a few ways that we can do that. So for one, I wanted to start with the idea of really infusing that social impact into our overall commercial strategies. Now, while I was at UN Studio, I was the Global Commercial Strategy 2030 program owner and lead. So that meant that I was leading the commercial strategy working group, which was formed with some of the partners, the managing director, directors from across the different entities. We had about 6 or 7 offices across the world. And we were working towards creating one commercial strategy that would link us all together. And so one of the things that's really important there was to integrate that social impact into it, to make sure that it's very much a robust part of the way that we think when it comes to the work that we're doing. So the work that we're doing, and when I say commercial strategy, I mean, overseeing all of the mix, in a sense, of all the buildings and all the projects that are running. So we're talking about the running, maybe the completed, and also the future projects that you want to have, and creating this mix of what it is that you want this portfolio to look like. What is the representation of the firm, of the work that you're doing in this mix of, all of the work, the services, and the products that you do. And that, of course, you need to do with the idea of remaining in line with the firm's DNA, with the competitive landscape, and minimizing risk. So one of the things there was to introduce this target portfolio idea, and to make sure that that was the crux of the commercial strategy, and that we could infuse these social impact aspects into that. So part of it was to put forward these 3 pillars. So on the left is the commercial value, which of course is anything that just ensures viability, that revenue growth, profitability of the services that are provided. Then all the way on the right is diversification, which is all about limiting that risk and dependencies, maybe on certain accounts, on certain markets, or certain topologies, depending on what's going on in the world and in the market, to make sure that you're able to withstand different issues in different sectors. And then in the center, which is one that's most relevant to this conversation, was especially looking at brand and impact, and how we could use it to uphold our values, our expertise, and remain relevant, and also have that competitive edge. So the brand and impact part was really looking at objectives to help ensure that the portfolio would uphold that brand ethos, but also give back in a meaningful way. And so it was important to really get that in there from the start, and looking at, how it could be a part of the ESG strategy, and what sort of themes and topics needed to be mentioned in there. And so it's all about including SMART goals as to what we wanted to achieve and how we wanted to measure. A big important part of it, which is always hard, is measuring social impact, right? Because it's easier to measure energy efficiency of a building, or these kinds of things that are set in numbers already. But when we come to that S of ESG, it's very hard to start to measure, or at least have conventions on how to measure social impact. But I think it's good to start with your own definitions and start with SMART goals. It can be square meters of affordable housing, for example, that you want to have across your portfolio, which we know that housing, given the situation in terms of homelessness, is also a factor to contributing to queer inclusive built environments, or at least thinking about the queer community there. But it's also about who you're working with, having targets in terms of the types of clients, the types of partners, the types of community engagement that you're doing. There's a myriad of ways of doing it, but thinking about those and having them be a part of the portfolio strategy is a really good way to start. So what does that mean? That means that you're going to have to be extremely proactive about the business development and marketing approach that you're taking. So it means you need to seek out organizations and partners that are aligned with your values and the social impact goals that you've set. And of course, that's, can go from anywhere from cold outreach, cold emailing, cold calling, but also inviting speakers to join, to speak on panels of things that you might be organizing, to bring them in a softer way than a cold call, or introducing them to relevant partners that you might have within your network, which can be a good way of getting to know each other. So that proactivity is going to be a big piece of seeking out those that you want to work with, that you agree with their way of working as well, to be able to make sure that they're commissioning also projects that will tend to be more queer inclusive in the outcome. So it's about looking also at their ESG policies or their way of communication around it, but making sure that there's no pink washing. We'll get into that later, which is hard to sometimes tell, but making sure that you're looking for partners that might be engaging in giving to queer charities, for example, or having some kind of social impact that they are communicating about and reporting on. And it can be, several different ways. There's also, of course, all the different certifications. It can be companies that are B Corps or that are GREV certified, or that have different types of ESG ratings. So it can be different ways of looking. Are they going that extra mile? Are they going beyond just, the bare minimum of what we need to do, because that's already a bit more than it used to be. But how are they trying to drive positive change? It's also a matter of thinking about who we team up with. So we assemble teams. We have this power of being able to put together the teams that are going to be working on the projects that are then going to be built and then going to be used, and spaces where people will live, work, play, etc. So using this opportunity to go beyond the brief or the bare minimum of the different stakeholders that are asked for in terms of the bid teams is an important piece. In my experience, there have been certain countries or certain spaces, certain sectors, which have more demanding standards and ask for better social engagement, or in terms of the types of groups that they ask to be a part of the bid teams. But it's good to use those high standards across the board as much as we can, and to bring different stakeholders that may not normally be included in the process into the process. And so this can be, of course, working with queer professionals, but also queer community organizations or queer community citizen experts. And an important piece there is always compensating them fairly for the work that they're doing, and recognizing that they are experts, just as valuable as anyone else who has a degree on the team or whatnot, but making sure that this perspective is valued and is therefore compensated is a big part of the piece. And I've been on projects where we've brought in local people who might have been very engaged in the community. In one of the projects I worked on in the bid team that we put together was a local theater actor who was very involved in what was going on in the community, and who was able to bring a completely different perspective to the bid. It can be something, of course, that you highlight in terms of the uniqueness of the makeup of your team, which can be a good thing in scoring extra points or in being able to win the bid. But it's also a way to make sure that they're a part of the team, and so that perspective is going to be infused into the project and not only consulted at the given standard moments where we need to participate with community and engage them. So being able to proactively engage and seek out these sorts of groups to make sure that they can be a part of the project is also a place where we have a lot of power as marketing and business development professionals. Now, another aspect is our visualizations. So, for example, if we think of the renders, we tend to reference man wash them and whitewash them a lot of the time, and hetero wash them. There's a lot of washing happening in the way that we visualize architecture. And so it's important to think about who we're representing here. There's many examples of places where we can find, you know, different cutouts or different people who aren't these Scandinavian sort of that were very popular at the beginning as coming out of the first, having all these different cutouts of people. But it's important because by not including queer people or people of color, marginalized groups in architectural visualizations, we're not only writing them out of our future spaces, but we're also suggesting that they never belonged in the first place. And I think this was a quote from Margaret Ravencroft, who's a communications officer, head of communications, sorry, at Coffee Architects. And that's quite right, that if you can't visualize our future spaces fairly and showing that diversity, showing these different people, for example, this queer couple that's walking their dog, which we tend not to see in visualizations, how can we really be trusted to create them that way? So something to definitely think about and where we can have power. And there's lots of sites where you can find good cutouts and people who are, diverse group of different people. And the same goes with if you say, okay, I'm marketing professional, I don't make the renders, the architects do that. What we do is in our bids, we do put together these lifestyle or moods images to paint a picture before there is, you know, any render, if we're at the stage of, you know, just the initial bid stage. And so at this point, it's also the images that we represent. If we try to Google search certain things, we might not find a mix of identities. We'll tend to find, if you search person doing whatever, you tend to find more reference men like people than the broad variety of people. You don't tend to find queer couples or hijabi women or people in wheelchairs. So it's important to make that effort. And I think if you say, you know, well, you know, it's very hard sometimes to find exactly the mix of images that I want. Well, AI has come and has helped us out with that one. So no excuses there, that we can really leverage AI to be able to create images. If we don't have the exact mix that we want to show, that we can do it. Now, important to steer clear of a stereotypical portrayal of people with AI, but it is something that we can leverage if we use it properly. Same goes for photography, and that's something that we also are in power of. Once a space has been finished, completed, then we take pictures to be able to get more projects and to showcase the wonderful work that we've done or that our teams have done. And here's just a nice cartoon representing a bit some of the things that we tend to do. And this I reflect on a personal anecdote. In one of the first jobs that I'd had, we had commissioned a photographer to take pictures of an apartment that we had completed. And one of the tasks was to get rid of everything that the residents, the people who commissioned the project, have, because, you know, it's ugly and it'll ruin the photo. We just want the pure architecture. So this, I'm sure that you deal with in many ways, working with architects and with teams that might have a very clear idea of how they want the design to look. But it's important that we also reflect more the reality of things. So a way that we can do that is to have different types of photography. So here I want to showcase Philippe Sarfati, which is a great architecture photographer, and we commissioned him when I was working at UN Studio to take pictures of the Booking.com headquarters that we had just completed in Amsterdam. And what's really nice about his style is that he mixes street architecture, street photography, with architectural photography. And so he starts to tell stories through people. And so the buildings are a part of a storyline and a narrative. And that can be a way to use the images that we have and that we commission through photographers to be able to create impact there. And so here are some more pictures of that he took of the Booking.com headquarters. And what's nice is you start to get the uses of the building a lot more than just the stark sort of empty images that are kind of traditionally used in the architecture world. The bottom one is another project in Rotterdam, but seeing these different users and the actual users who are sometimes, and a lot of the time, non-reference men, starts to bring a different narrative to our work. And I think that we have a lot of power because we choose who's taking the pictures, right? Two more, and then I will close. But so one aspect is also about speaking the language of our clients. And we know that sometimes that they'll be hesitant. So those commissioning the projects that we're working on, they may be hesitant to just get on board if it's just, if they don't necessarily see the gain in terms of their KPIs and their goals. So it's important to understand those, speak their language, and be able to communicate the work and the impact that we're having or that we're trying to get in a way that speaks to them. If I look at the example of the Arnhem Central Station, which is one I showed earlier, this one, when we were communicating about it, of course, we can talk about the sight lines and how it creates more safety, and that is things that we would talk about, but we'd also focus on the fact that without having all these columns and all of this extra, well, material in terms of cost, there's also those operational costs of running the train station, of not having to have as much surveillance or security staff. And therefore, there's another KPI that's being impacted in terms of the financial benefits and the cost efficiencies and the long-term savings that are being gained by this design choice, which is also has a social impact. So it's really about being able to communicate the impact of something in different ways depending on your audience, right? So last but not least, it's very important that we steer clear from pinkwashing. I think especially when it comes to marketing and communicating, we have a lot of power in the words or the images that we use, but it's important that we don't make it something that's not authentic and that has nothing really to do with advancing LGBTQ equality or inclusion, but is more just about superficially being sympathetic to some of these issues. So that's really important to think about and to remain genuine with the work that you're showcasing and the types of clients that you're working with. So to wrap it all up with the key takeaways, in a nutshell, it's really about integrating that social impact into the commercial strategy and in the way that we're thinking about what we value in terms of marketing and business goals, partnering with clients that are advancing these queer inclusion and advocacy and that are doing that in a genuine manner and doing the work that's needed. Building those diverse and impact bid teams, a really nice way to be able to have proposals that are also unique, but very much bring in the folks that can bring that experience, that we compensate them right, that we're able to have them in the project, working on it from the inside to be able to infuse those perspectives and that wisdom right there in the project. So another one, the diversity in terms of the imagery and the visual representation, making sure that we have that intersectional aspect of representing those that really do use the spaces that we have, and also sending signals of what we are trying to achieve and what we would like the world to look like is also important. Speaking the client's language, making sure that we're highlighting the benefits in terms of their KPIs and goals, and lastly, avoiding pinkwashing. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the questions.
Wow. So my head is spinning. That was an absolute masterclass for me, and so much to unpack and so much to think about. We do have a few questions in the Q&A. So one person said I might have missed this or misheard from the beginning, but can you explain again how designing for diverse audiences also results in more biodiverse cities?
Sure. So I think one of the things there was thinking about the fact that reference man, so designing for non-reference man is also about thinking that we're not only designing for humans, so not people-centric, but really thinking life-centric. So the fact that reference man is much more industrial kind of age where, you don't really care for nature, but we know that that's not something that we care for now, type of way of being. So embracing this life-centric approach is something that then leads to much more biodiversity, because you're thinking about flora and fauna. And then another aspect of it is the fact that in terms of queer inclusion specifically, but I think beyond queer inclusion, just the sense of inclusion, nature is a big one that somehow comes up a lot in surveys as something that makes us feel more inclusive, more connected. And therefore, in thinking about nature and in thinking about the biodiversity within nature, so not just, like I said, manicured lawns is not nature. Doesn't mean it's green, but that's not what we mean. Much more organic, looking at the richness, the diversity that's also present in nature, and including that in our spaces also helps to make this feeling of diversity that then we can see back in our society as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. Any suggestions on how to weave these principles into our firm values? How do you work with leadership to define these objectives?
Sure. So yeah, definitely think it's important that they are part of the firm values. So that means working with leadership, working with the people within the firm, across the firm, to be able to decide, what are our values, to also, take stock of maybe the situation. What are our values today? Where do we want to be? So at UN Studio, what we were doing is really working towards that 2030 mark. There's some things that are external in the sense that there are aspects or things that we need to start thinking about, because there's, different codes that are coming up, different legal aspects, things that we need, like boxes, you could argue, that we might need to check. So there's that can be sometimes a push for those who are really lagging behind. But going beyond there and saying, where do we want to be? How do we want to put ourselves on the map? It's important to showcase the value of thinking about these things and embedding them into the strategy, and especially the commercial strategy. It really is something that's valuable. So the brand and impact part that I showed you in terms of the different pillars, it's about, making sure that you have can be a competitive edge, but making sure that you're giving back is not only about giving. I guess there's an aspect of also what it says then about your firm, what sort of partners might want to then work with you. It might open certain doors. So I think it's really about showcasing the benefits, the business benefits can be, if that's where you need to go. But I guess it's a speaking the language thing. What's the language of the leadership? What are their priorities? How can we sort of try to bring those into something that might make sense to them? But yeah, it will be different for different firms. Different leadership will see things in different ways. But I think that there's a way to be able to push, at least, to get things done and get some change.
Yeah, awesome. Brenda, you asked how you get your hands on a recording. Great question. We will have the recording up shortly after this, maybe early next week, for about 30 days, because of the sensitive nature of the content and because of our partnership with Framework. We don't keep it up in perpetuity. So you will have about 30 days to share this great content with your networks. And then one last question, Nyasha, can you please define again what pinkwashing means?
Sure. So pinkwashing is also sometimes known as rainbow washing, and it's really the strategy of deploying messages that are going to be superficially sympathetic towards the queer community, but for ends that usually have nothing to do with the LGBTQ equality or inclusion. So it's like greenwashing, where you're, sending certain message, sending certain signals, but then not necessarily walking the talk or that kind of thing. You're doing it to be maybe to be seen or to appear like you're doing things, but you're not really. So it's just about making sure that you're authentic.
Okay. Thanks for sharing it. We got one more snuck in. Sorry. Would you have any advice for a company whose leadership is scared to promote public statements of supporting diverse communities because they worry about what we perceive or receive as pinkwashing?
Yeah, no, and that I can understand. It's always people are sometimes you're not sure if you should make statements about things or if you shouldn't. I mean, I think the real thing is the statements are one thing, but the actions are another. And if you're just if you're reporting on your actions, on what you're doing and how you are actually contributing to LGBTQ equality or inclusion, then that's fine. I mean, there's no pink washing there. If it's just to say things and you're not doing anything else, then I would refrain from doing it because it's disingenuous. But I think the main thing is not focusing so much on what we should say. It's more about making sure, what are we doing? Are we contributing to this in any way? And if you are, I mean, then you can choose to shout it from the rooftops or not. But I think the main thing is to make sure that it's genuine and that it's something that is being done across the work that the firm is doing first and foremost. So I know we're a bit short on time, didn't leave too much time for questions, but you can always reach out as well to me, happy on LinkedIn or Instagram or whatnot, happy to answer any questions further.
This has been great. I want to thank you. I want to thank Russell. I want to thank Kevin, our producer extraordinaire. Just know that SMPS is a resource. Just as Framework Leadership is, please continue to seek out our DEI page where the recording will live for about 4 weeks, and also our other offerings. We will be launching a DEI certificate very soon, so be on the lookout for an email for that. It's a very busy summer. Our next DEI Town Hall will complement this one very well. It's about accessibility in the built environment. And so please join us for that. Hopefully I'll see you all at Amplify AEC in July next month. Thank you all. This ends our webinar, and please, please stay in touch with us. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.